Thanks for joining. Hi, my name is Siddharth Bhai. I'm a product manager with Databricks and excited to speak with you this afternoon. Databricks SQL, what's not to like? It has amazing performance. You can use it for all of your BI queries, powers rich visualizations. If you go ahead and take a look at performance benchmarks like TPC-DS and others, it's unparalleled, much faster, much more cost-effective than many other cloud data warehouses on the market. You're able to derive a lot of business insights and value. My first message to you is, if you're not yet using DB-SQL, you're probably missing out. In this session, brought to you directly by the product managers who are listening to your woes and working on the next features to make it even more awesome, we'll talk to you about how you can use Databricks SQL at enterprise scale so that you can derive insights and add more business value quickly and effectively. Databricks SQL is a serverless data warehouse. It's built on the Databricks Lakehouse platform, lets you run all of your SQL and BI applications at scale. What's exciting about it is if you go ahead and take a look at the industry studies that have been done by independent third parties, it offers up to 12 times better price performance, being an enterprise-grade cloud data warehouse. Because all of your data remains in place, you author data access policies once with Unity Catalog. It embraces open APIs and formats, and your BI users can use the BI tools of their choice with absolutely no vendor lock-in. Reduces management overhead for you, scales up clusters. With the Photon engine, it comes with very fast query performance at extremely low cost, making this a great no-brainer business decision for your organizations. But don't take my word for it. A lot of enterprises have adopted Databricks SQL at scale. I don't know about you, but I'm a big fan of origin stories. And when it comes to products, I think there's hardly any that gets better than Databricks SQL. We GA'd this product 2 years ago. This is a slide that our CEO, Ali Ghodsi, showed in the keynote yesterday. And you can see over 4,600 organizations are already actively using it. It is approaching 10% of our company's revenues. A lot of organizations. Our marketing team put together this beautiful slide. To be honest, when it hit my inbox, I kind of got excited. I'm like, wait, I use that company, and that, and that. I lost count as we approached double digits. I don't know how many of these organizations win your businesses, but that's a lot of momentum. It's very powerful. If so many people are doing it, they must be getting some tangible value. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. So for Johnson & Johnson, they discovered that when they were able to use the Photon engine, they were able to get extremely fast query performance for low cost. Our friends at Atlassian found that BI workloads powered by Databricks SQL enable dashboard reporting. ABN AMRO, they found the Power BI integration very exciting, and that made it possible to get data and insights for their SQL analysts. Atlassian has thousands of business users. ABN AMRO has tens of thousands of business users using Databricks SQL. Now, what is it that we can learn from all of these organizations? And in the rest of the session, we're going to share with you the best practices that we have heard from our customers, many that we have in mind as we design our features, to arm you with information to go back and run Databricks SQL at enterprise scale. So we're organizing this session in 3 segments. First, we'll talk about identity and administration, how you can bring in these tens of thousands of users and more to Databricks. We'll talk to you about security and governance next. So as your usage start expanding from a few projects into the hundreds, everything flows great and meets your compliance requirements. And then we'll round it off with insights into getting the maximum performance and cost effectiveness as you scale your usage to multiple business units in our organization. Let's start with identity and administration. I'll talk to you about 4 things today. First, you want to bring in your users into Databricks. Let's face it, if your users can't log in, none of the rest of the stuff is of value to them. So we'll talk about single sign-on. Now, in Azure Databricks, like all other Azure services, we're integrated with Azure Active Directory, so you don't need to configure SSO. Google Cloud, we integrate with Google Cloud Identity. AWS is known for the optionality it offers enterprise customers, so you can set up your identity provider single sign-on with AWS. A lot of usage tends to be when the user is not interactively sitting in front of the console. So for non-interactive usage, we have support for tokens. Again, cloud-native tokens, Azure AD for Azure Databricks, Google ID tokens for Google Cloud. And when it comes to AWS, you can use OAuth tokens for both user and service principal authentication. Observability is another important area, especially when you have such a distributed architecture, managed tables, external tables, users accessing from different locations. It's pretty exciting how Databricks SQL can give you a single lens into billing, lineage, access control through system tables. I'll walk you through all 4 of these. First, let's start off with identities. Now, you have your users and groups typically mastered in an identity provider of your choice. You can just go ahead and sync them over SCIM to Databricks accounts. Available on all 3 clouds. You can use an IDP connector or write your own SCIM API scripts to bring your users and groups in. Next, you can manage these identities centrally inside Databricks. What this lets you do is then say these users and these account level groups can access this type of data, or they can have access to these workspaces. Now, what's interesting here is if you configure sync directly to the account level, A, you get account level groups for the unified governance. Second, your administrators don't have to set up individual sync pipelines to workspaces. And third, it's just faster and quicker as your usage grows across the organization. Like I mentioned, Azure DB and Google Cloud come with built-in SSO. You don't have to configure anything. When it comes to AWS, you can configure an IDP of your choice. We work with SAML, we work with OIDC. Customers have a wide variety of identity providers they set up with Databricks. With unified login on AWS, when you go ahead and set up identity, single sign-on, as new workspaces come up, you don't have to go back and rewire SSO for them. And if you apply just these 2 best practices, it means when your users are logging in from popular BI tools of their choice, for example, you might have an analyst who likes to use Tableau. They can go ahead and initiate single sign-on directly from within that tool. Brings up a typical login prompt, gets redirected to your identity provider. They log in. If you have multi-factor authentication configured, guessing most of you do, can I get a quick show of hands? 3/4 of the room went up. The remaining 1/4 still needs a little bit of coffee. We'll get that taken care of. But when you have MFA that's getting applied, and a token that is not expiring because somebody forgot to renew their personal access token, it's far, far more powerful. And you get that with Databricks SQL and Identity SSO. Even for your administrators, it simplifies the job. Because you, instead of having to manage 1 pipeline per workspace, you're now just managing 1 sync pipeline per account. By the way, that also means as you create new groups or certain groups need access to certain workspaces, guess what? You're not having to phone home the IT admin again. Your Databricks administrator can just manage all of that inside Databricks. For your end users, they're not having to hunt around for workspace 7 tile or bookmark that URL. They just hit the Databricks account URL, they see a list of workspaces they're permission to work in, and they can just jump in. Identity tokens are a very important discussion. You can use Azure AD tokens, Google ID tokens. The examples I show you on the slide are if you're a user who just wants to get a token for some experimentation, you can run Databricks CLI and get yourself an OAuth token. As a best practice security measure, a lot of the times, you want to use service principals. You can actually use service principals. You can use workflows with SPs to orchestrate and have your DB SQL jobs in production. Very powerful. And I'd be remiss if I did not talk about system tables. Now, the very interesting differentiator and an advantage of the Lakehouse platform is you govern everything centrally, though the data is distributed. Now, with system tables, you're able to get billing, audit logs, lineage, grants, all of that delivered in one place for you to reference and query. This lets you have very unparalleled, interesting, single point of view. You can audit, you can have alerts. You can also keep great tabs on observability and cost effectiveness. And you'll see us talk about system tables more through the rest of the session. At this point, I'd like to invite my colleague Samrat to come and talk to you about security and governance.
Thank you. And just as I start, there's a bit of a snafu with the mic. So hi, I'm Samrat, and I'm going to talk to you about how can you keep your environment secure as you scale from a small number of apps, you start there, and as you scale up to hundreds of different applications. So I'll talk to you about how to scale on the user dimension. I'll talk to you about how do you scale on the application or platform dimension. And finally, Jeremy will actually talk about runtime scale, right? So those are the three aspects. So diving into how do you scale along the platform dimension? How do you secure your platform at scale? So to simplify it, we'll talk about effectively three aspects of security that you should care about. One is about data governance. How do you govern access to your data across hundreds of workspaces? And we'll demonstrate the best practices with Unity Catalog. Second is workspace security. How do you ensure that your data is being processed in an environment that is actually secured and can meet your compliance obligations? The third is posture management. Sure, you can get the primitives of data governance and securing your workspaces from the first two, but it's not very useful if you have to manually configure it across hundreds of workspaces, right? So how do you manage posture at scale? So we'll talk through these three aspects. So starting with data governance with Unity Catalog. So you might have seen many Unity Catalog sessions in this summit and outside, so I will not belabor too much into what is Unity Catalog, but I'll just talk through a few key aspects of it that is important in the context of scale. The first aspect is that with Unity Catalog, you can define access to your data in one place across all your workspaces. Prior to Unity Catalog, you would have to go to each workspace and configure it on a workspace-specific basis, some of these IAM capabilities. Now you can do it in one place. And you can do this based upon two dimensions. First is the user and the workspace. So this particular slide will talk about what can you do with respect to the user or identities, and then we'll talk about workspaces. So the first thing that you do is, with users, you can define very fine-grained access controls, right? So you can define row and column level access controls. An example of a row level access control is to say, for example, that Siddharth can only access his salary and the salary of his direct and indirect reports, right? This is an example of a row level access control. It's something you can define once, and now it applies across all workspaces, right? Another example is PII control, and we have given an example here of a masking function that is based upon the context of who is signing in, right? So in this example, only users in the group admin can actually access SSN, the social security number. All other users can still run the query, but they will see a masked value, right? So these are examples of how you can define the right kind of governance posture with respect to users and groups within Unity Catalog. We just talked about the fact that you can now define it once, and it works across workspaces. But one of the first things that comes to mind when I say that is, can I really access my SSN, the example that you gave to me, from some arbitrary workspace that was just created for development or for some POCs? That's not a behavior that I want, right? What happened to the fact that I could constrain my access to certain workspaces only? So we have brought that back. We have restored that capability to you through a feature that we call catalog isolation, effectively. What that does is you can now isolate your data for each catalog into its own storage account or S3 bucket. And at the same time, you can then define constraints to say that this catalog can only be accessed from certain workspaces. So in the previous example, we were talking about SSN access. Let's say a user in the group admin can only access the data when they come in from the prod workspace. But if the same user were to log in from the dev or the staging workspace, they would no longer have access to that catalog, the production catalog, and therefore no access to the SSN. It's a more coarse-grained control. Think of this as keeping your PHI data to PHI workspaces or PCI data to your PCI workspaces. That kind of a coarse-grained control and an umbrella control. And then you can have fine-grained controls within the workspace at the user level. Right? So this is pretty important that you have this coarse-grained control because that enables you to scale, right? And allows you to put these umbrella controls that makes you comfortable to then delegate some of the user-level permissions to other users. And anytime you're operating at scale and you're delegating controls, then the next thing that you absolutely must have is observability, right? You must know what is the posture? Like, I delegated those controls. Did that person just for simplicity decide I want to grant access to everybody in my organization just to simplify data sharing? You want to know what your posture is. And then, given the posture, you want to know who actually accessed the data, right? And lastly, once they access the data, what did they do with it? Right? So to enable all of this, we provide a series of system tables for observability. I think Siddharth touched upon it. But I'll talk about 3 specific tables here. One is the table privileges, which gives you an understanding of your posture as to who can access the data. So you can look at all the privileges that have been granted against a given object with this table. The second is the audit table, which answers the question, who has actually accessed the data, right, and when. And lastly, the table lineage, which tells you what did they do with it. For example, did they copy it to another table? Right? So with this, you get comprehensive visibility into your access patterns that are happening in your organizations, and you can then rectify your posture as required. So we talked about how you can control for access. And we talked about how you can isolate it to certain environments that can meet the security requirements when you process data. So, but how do you actually secure the workspaces at scale? So the first thing that we recommend is that for data that is sensitive, that you enable a feature that we provide called customer managed keys. With customer managed keys is a feature that enables you to encrypt the data, but with a key that is rooted in a key that is stored in your KMS backend, right? Key management store backend. So it's AKV on Azure or KMS on AWS, for example. The key property of this is that it is a single point of control that you have over both your data as well as key assets. So Databricks also supports CMK for key assets like notebooks and models. So if you pull that key, it's your one point of control that then denies access to all privileged entities, whether it is the cloud provider or Databricks itself, from accessing your data. So it's a fairly coarse-grained and strong control, right? But you do this, you can configure this on a per workspace basis. And once you configure this, it applies to both classic as well as serverless SQL. You don't have to do anything special for serverless. It just, because your data remains the same. Second issue, okay, I have loaded my data and I've secured it at rest. Now I want to use the data. We talked about how you can access it, but how do I protect it from exfiltration from my environment? As many of you know, mitigating exfiltration risk is not a simple problem. It's never a black and white. It's about mitigating the risk, the most obvious risks over there. So there are multiple layers of protection that we provide against this problem. The first layer is when you're using Unity Catalog, we provide very strong credential protection for the data access credential. What do I mean by that? What I mean is with Unity Catalog, the actual credential that is used to access the data is not the user credentials. One of the most prominent forms of attacks to gain access to data or for some exfiltration is there's a phishing attack and somebody gains access to a user credential. But now that user credential cannot be used to access data. Because with Unity Catalog, you have a system credential, a managed identity on Azure or an IAM role on AWS that is actually used to access the data. Credentials issued against that identity are actually not available to your end users. They're issued to the runtimes, and then when you go to serverless, this becomes even more secure because that runtime itself is isolated from the user. So that is provides that, and it provides that isolation, and you can no longer access it, right? And the token that is issued is both scoped down in time. It's a 1 hour duration, and it's scoped down in terms of the amount of data it can access. So it might be able to access only certain files and not your entire bucket. So this is the first level of control. And then on top of that, we provide end-to-end private connectivity, so you can keep your workspace secure. So all these rows that you see with the green arrows, you can configure private link to keep it private, right, and not have any internet access. But obviously, in some cases where you do want to access that environment from the internet, you can enable that with IP ACLs. We provide your ability to configure IP ACLs both at the workspace and account level. The last thing I want to cover is that for many of you who are processing regulated data like HIPAA or PCI data, Databricks meets a wide set of industry standards for compliance. But on top of that, we give you a capability called Compliance Security Profile that you can configure at the account or workspace level. This is a way for you to manage your security posture at scale. It enforces certain properties like encryption in transit, or the use of Nitro on AWS, for example, VMs. So these are certain properties. It also enables scanning of images, for example. All of these are enforced against those workspaces and all accounts and are not editable by anybody else. So that's a way for you to manage it at scale. So how do you now manage posture? So the last piece is, OK, you got lots of security primitives that Siddharth and I talked through some of them. But there are many more, and even beyond this slide. So the way you manage them, what our observation is that the best practices, the people who have successfully managed Databricks, are using Terraform. But it's not just about the tool. What is the template? How do you get to the right template? So Databricks, we have over time captured the best practices into a doc with common and high security models with checkboxes. So you can now take, and we have created Terraform templates that are derived from this doc. So we suggest that you start with those. You can customize it. Make sure you're checking all the boxes in the doc that we provide. And you can use that to automate the creation and the configuration management of workspaces at scale. No matter what automation you use, as we all know, as you scale out, things fall out of compliance with what your golden state that you want it to be. So it's very important that you're able to monitor your posture at scale, right? So we provide a security analysis tool that allows you to then compare your workspaces against the suggested best practices for your industry domain, for example, in some cases, right? It automatically detects deviations, and it flags those deviations. And it also identifies mitigation steps as the one identified at the top over there. This tool is available on all 3 cloud platforms, and and it includes the Terraform deployments for all 3 platforms as well from us. So thus, you can now manage security posture at scale. Siddharth and I covered a lot of stuff. You don't have to remember all of it. You can get all this material from the Security and Trust Center. It is something we certainly recommend you go to. Everything that I talked about, the templates, the best practices, it's all documented in there and more at the Security and Trust Center. With that, I'll hand it over to Siddharth to give you to demonstrate how we have managed to apply these practices that we talked about at a scale of 50K users.
Thank you, Samrat. So we've covered a lot of material. I don't know about you, but I'm a product guy. I like seeing bits in action. So I've gone ahead and put together what will hopefully be an interesting demo. Give me 10 seconds to get it set up. OK, and let's restart. Great. So you're looking at an Azure Active Directory, pretty enterprise scale. You can see there are 50,000 users in here. Might be typical of what you might see in your organizations. As I switch over to groups, I've gone ahead and created 3 groups: data stewards, engineering, and finance. The finance group houses all of our financial analysts. I'll now sync these groups over and users into Databricks. So we'll switch gears. And what's coming up on your screen is you're looking at Databricks Account Console. I'm logged in as an account admin. And as you can see, all of the users have been synced in. The groups we were looking at are here. Now, to make the demo simple and easy to follow, I've just synced in 3 groups. But we have customers who have synced in thousands of groups from their enterprise AD to Databricks. As I move over to Workspaces, again, for simplicity, I have a single workspace, revenue operations. It's running in East US2 and has a UC metastore, Diascale attached to it. So all of the centralized governance policies will be in this metastore. I'll now switch over and show you the workspace view. So we're now looking at revenue operations. And as you can see, I'm logged in as a workspace administrator. You can see my SQL warehouses in this view. I'll switch over to the Data Explorer tab to show you the data we have created. Using Unity Catalog's tree-level namespace, I have a revenue catalog, a financial schema, and an orders table. Notice that data stewards are the ones who have been in charge of data governance policies. This table houses SSNs, order regions, as might be typical of an e-commerce site or other businesses. Now I'll switch on over to dashboards, and I created a quick dashboard to show you some of the sample data we've put in the orders table. As you can see, we've been getting orders from US, UK, and France. Now this is how everything is set up in Databricks, but where are your users? A lot of them prefer using their own preferred BI tools. So I'm now switching over, and we're looking at a data analyst. This is Power BI running on Windows 11, and as I've hit refresh, Power BI is running in direct query mode. So the analyst single signed on into Databricks. Pull this chart. Now they're noticing that the revenue is going down. They may go ahead and do deeper investigations from their tool of choice. They never had to move or work within the Databricks UI if they didn't want to. Look at the chart on the right. Does it look a little different than the one I showed you a minute ago? That's because this is the analyst. And what the analyst can see is a region chart. And the region chart is only showing you region equals US. Any guesses as to why? Row-level security, exactly. As Samrat explained to you, we have row-level security, and I also have a column mask applied, which is why you will notice that the SSN column at the bottom, it is showing you asterisks. The table contains the actual SSNs, but because we have a column mask applied, the analyst doesn't see it, gets filtered in their view. Now from here, we'll go back and take a look at the Databricks Workspace. What do we see here? I'll move over to dashboards, and I'll show you a simple dashboard I've created using the access audit events in system tables. So as people are working with your Lakehouse, this is just silently observing and picking up all the audits. You can see there are accounts, UC, Databricks SQL, and other login events. Not just audit events. You can actually go to query history. And the queries we just ran as we refresh the Power BI dashboard are showing up here. If you want to, you can zoom in and see what any other analyst is doing. So all of this gives you a lot of good centralized governance and insight, although your users are working from their tools in a distributed environment. And you know what's nice about this setup? As more analysts join your organization, just go back and update the finance group membership in your Azure Active Directory or your preferred IDP. It syncs over, and you do not have to touch any of the ACLs inside Databricks. At this point, I'd love to invite Jeremy to talk to you about performance.
All right, thanks, Siddharth. All right, so the next bucket is observability and performance for DB SQL. All right, so what we wanted to do is base this around kind of the 4 best practices that we see large enterprise customers using today. And these 4 buckets of best practices are monitoring, alerting, preventing, and then scaling users. So I'm going to go through the first 3, which are more focused around observability. Then I have a really interesting demo where I'm going to show you how performance scales for DB SQL. So first, let's focus on monitoring. So the number 1 best practice when we talk to customers who are large, they need to figure out a way that they need to scale cost attribution across their company. And the number 1 way we see that happen today is through tags. You can add tags directly to a warehouse. And now with system tables, we see those customers that are using the system tables take advantage of the tags automatically propagating to the central billing system tables. The tags we commonly see are team, product, and project. And let me just show you just kind of how easy this is to work. So if you go to your warehouse that a team is using, you go to the advanced options and you click tags. You can add team, finance, and just like that, the billing system tables will automatically propagate those warehouse tags and directly add them into the table for you. So you can get down to the hour cost by DBU for each team. Second best practice, we see that these larger businesses aren't spending a lot of time having to debug. And the reason is because they're using these system tables to identify change history. So one of the new system tables that's coming out, or that has come out, is the warehouses table. And you can track every event and every change that has been made. So if you see that warehouse suddenly isn't performing as well as it was, you can log into change history, and you can see like, oh, someone logged in, someone changed the warehouse from a large or an extra large down to an extra small, and suddenly the warehouse is no longer performing as well. All right, the second bucket is alerting. So best practice number 3 is the proactive warehouse monitoring. So with the warehouse event system tables, we're starting to see customers are setting up, especially these larger customers, are alerts on long-running warehouses running past certain times. So if the warehouse is supposed to turn off at 5 or 6 o'clock at nighttime, they're getting alerts when these warehouses are still running late. If the warehouse has been upscaled all day long, or if the warehouse is seeing large cluster spikes, so it's going to the max and it's just hanging out there all day. It's very easy to do. You can write the query yourself, or we have a set of queries you can use. But you create the query, and you simply go to alerts, you click create an alert, you add that query in, and then the next thing it's going to say, like for this use case, is how long should this warehouse be running? Alert after an hour if it's running too long. And you can start getting those messages and alerts in your Slack, in your email. Suddenly, this becomes a very proactive way to monitor long-running warehouses. Third is preventing. So one way that we also see customers take advantage of some of the new controls is by preventing long-running queries. And they do that through automatic query termination. By default, all of the automatic query termination is at 48 hours, but this can be set at a workspace level or a per query level. More coming soon. And here's a quick demo of what that looks like. And so you can choose set statement timeout equals to 1. This is just 1 second. This can go all the way up to days. And the statement will just time out. It will no longer run. You can do this at the workspace level to prevent any long-running queries that are there. And then lastly is I want to talk to you about scaling users. This one is when you have thousands and thousands of users. You just saw Siddharth add 50,000 users. How do you get all those 50,000 users getting insights? And the secret is to use serverless, and you don't have to do anything else. And so we put together a quick demo to show you kind of what that looks like. All right, so this is a serverless warehouse. It's a medium, and you can see here it's active. They have one cluster active, but it can scale up to 40. So you can see there's no funny business going on. There's no active queries, there's no sessions, there's one cluster, and we're going to do a load test. And just want to show kind of what this kind of takes off your plate. You don't have to worry about right sizing. You don't have to worry about any of the other things you have to do when you manage a classic or a pro warehouse. So you can see we're already at roughly 10 seconds in, 5,000 queries have been completed. The average latency started around 1,100 milliseconds, so right above a second. It's decreasing as more clusters are getting spun up. We're hitting top QPS now around 550 QPS at a time, or per second. And you can see over here, there's no queries that are erroring. We're just kind of, the warehouse is spinning up, it's flexing as it needs to, it's scaling as it needs to. And as we're getting closer to the 60-second mark, it'll start winding down. But one more kind of call out I just want to make is, as you can see here, with 25,000 queries, we're still sub-second for latency. We're at 700 milliseconds. And as this winds down, I'm just kind of going to jump ahead a little bit so you can see. We went up to 19 clusters within 60 seconds. You don't have to right size. You don't have to do a lot of the thought and the math of trying to figure out what exactly needs to be, what's the right perfect size. It'll flex as you need. All right, and lastly, I want to just cover in summary. There's kind of three main buckets of running DB SQL at scale. There's identity administration, and the top recommendations are sync your identities to the account, configure single sign-on, and use authentication tokens where needed. For security and governance, use UC to govern data access, secure the perimeter with private link, and use Terraform and the security analysis tool. And then for observability and performance, use proactive alerts for these main cost drivers, such as your warehouses running, long-running queries, attribute costs to the right teams, and then scale to thousands of users through serverless. All right, thank you.